This video is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc. with free weekly content and free shipping on orders over $150. You can save 5% site-wide by using the promo code MTGMudsta. If you're looking for a direct way to help the channel, please consider joining my Patreon and becoming a member of the generic Goblin Gang. Hey gang, and welcome back. In today's game, I am rocking Halana and Alena, keeping Sylvan Library, Mindless Automaton, Dustshell Crawler, Baldaran Thrillseeker, Roaring Earth, Mountain, and a Rootbound Crag. Maximus is Sleeved Up Slicer, keeping Iron Crag Feet, Jeska's Will, Brass Squire, Umezawa's Jitte, and 3 mountains. Mika is playing his horror-themed deck, keeping Tainted Isle, Sky Diamond, Treasure Cruise, 3 swamps, and an island. New to the channel and playing a new commander, Pat has brought his Hazezon Desert Matters deck, and he keeps Desert of the True, Return of the Wild Speaker, Talisman of Conviction, Commander Sphere, Forest, Crop Rotation, and Scavenger Grounds. I win the die roll and start us off. I draw and play a mountain. Max draws, also playing a mountain and passing. Mika plays a swamp. Pat draws and plays a tapped Desert of the True. I've got a Rootbound Crag for my turn, and then pay 2 for Sylvan Library. Max just plays a mountain. Mika draws, plays a Tainted Isle, and casts Sky Diamond. Pat's got a Forest for turn, and casts Talisman of Conviction. During my draw step, I get to use my Sylvan Library, but don't pay any life to keep any extras, and I play a Forest once I move to my main phase. I then cast a Pure Strain Genestealer, passing to Max. Max has a mountain for turn, and pays enough for a Brass Squire, passing after that. Mika's got an island for turn, and then casts Blade of Selves. He passes after that. Pat draws and plays Hazezon, taking the damage from tapping his Talisman for colored mana. He then plays a Scavenger Grounds, and gets to make 2 Sand Warriors from Hazezon's trigger, and passes. I draw after using my Sylvan Library, and don't pay to keep any extras. I then play a Command Tower, and cast Halana and Alena. I go to combat, putting 2 more +1/+1 counters onto the Genestealer thanks to my trigger, and then swing it at Mika. I get my on-attack trigger from the Genestealer, removing a counter to find a basic, and Mika then takes the hit. Max draws and plays a mountain. He then plays out Tenza, Goda's Maul, and passes to Mika. Mika draws and plays an island. He then taps out for his commander, and passes after that. Pat draws and plays a Commander Sphere. He then taps the sphere for a green for crop rotation, sacrificing the Scavenger Grounds to go and find a Shefet Dunes. This has him making 2 more Sand Warriors from Hazezon seeing a desert come in. Pat then replays his Scavenger Grounds from his graveyard and makes 2 more Sand Warriors, and then casts Inspiring Leader. Going to combat, Pat swings the Sand Warriors at Max and Max blocks the Brass Squire and activates it to equip it with the Maul. I take the 3 while Max has blocked the hit, and Pat passes after that. I draw and pay the full 8 to Sylvan Library, keeping the extra cards. I then play a Forest and cast Incubation Druid, and then a Dustshell Crawler, putting the +1/+1 counter from the Crawler onto the Druid as it comes in. Going to combat, I put the Halana and Alena counters onto the Genestealer again, and then swing it at Max. I remove a counter to go and find a land, and he takes the hit, and I pass. Max draws and casts Iron Crag Feet for 7 red mana, and since he's now only allowed to play 1 more spell, cast Death Kiss. Once it resolves, he equips the Maul onto it with the remaining mana, and passes. Mika draws and plays an island, and then casts a Maddening Cacophony kicked, and we all mill half of our decks. We all give him the highlights of our graveyards to see what he wants, and after some window shopping, Mika moves through his end step, and gets his commander's trigger to steal my Zopandrel from my graveyard, and he passes to Pat. Pat draws, and plays a Hashep Oasis from his graveyard, once more making 2 Sand Warriors. Going to combat, he swings 5 Sand Warriors at Mika. Mika blocks 2 of them, and before moving to damage, Pat casts Return of the Wild Speaker, but not in the mode you think. Instead, he chooses to draw some cards, and after that, Pat moves to discard and passes to me. I draw, and pay 4 life for Sylvan Library to keep 1 extra card. I then play out an Unnatural Growth, and go to combat. Pat asks where I'm going to send my team, and without a definitive answer, he decides to cast Wilt on my Unnatural Growth before I actually move to combat. I then move to combat and get my Halana and Alena trigger, putting the trigger onto the Genestealer, and then swing the Genestealer at Pat. I get to remove a counter from it to go and grab a mountain, and Pat then takes the hit. After that, I cast Chain Reaction, wiping the board, and then pass turn. Max draws and plays a mountain. He then casts Slicer for the more than he meets the eye cost. He then moves Tenza to it and goes to combat. Max then swings Slicer at Mika, who takes the hit, and Max then converts Slicer to the front side after that. With nothing else, Max passes. Max donates Slicer on Mika's upkeep, and Mika then draws for turn. He plays an island, and then goes to combat. Mika swings Slicer at me for a total of 12, which I have to take, and after that, Mika then replays his commander and passes to Pat. Pat gets Slicer on his upkeep thanks to Maximus, and draws, and then plays Hazezon again in his main phase. He then plays out Endless Sands from his graveyard, making 2 Sand Warriors. Going to combat, Pat swings Slicer at me to take me out, and then casts Martyr's Cause in his post-combat main phase. However, since he can't sacrifice Slicer, Pat has to pass. Maximus draws and casts Jessica's Will, getting 6 red mana and gets to exile his top 3. He then plays a mountain from the exiled cards, and then plays Inspiring Statuary from his hand. He follows up with Umezawa's Jitte, and then casts an Emberwild Captain, becoming the Monarch. He wraps things up by equipping the Jitte to Slicer, and then goes to combat. Max swings Slicer at Pat, who responds by sacrificing a warrior token to Martyr's Cause, and prevents all of Slicer's damage. In his post-combat main phase, Max then casts Masterwork of Ingenuity as a copy of Mika's Blade of Selves, and passes after that. Mika gets Slicer on his upkeep, and then draws and plays a Swamp. He plays a Ravenous Chupacabra, taking out Maximus's Emberwild Captain, and then moves to combat. He swings his commander at Max, and Slicer at Pat. Pat decides to sacrifice a token to continue to Fog Slicer, and Max takes the 3 and mills 3. With notable hits for Mika being Soul Ring and Sculpting Steel. After that, Mika moves to his end step and gets to steal Maximus's Soul Ring from the graveyard, and then draws from being the Monarch and passes to Pat. As is tradition, Pat gets Slicer and draws for turn. He then plays an Impact Tremors and plays out Raminap Ruins, making 2 Sand Warrior tokens from Hazezon's trigger and dealing 2 to each opponent. He then follows up with Tempt with Discovery, and Max takes the offer while Mika declines. Pat finds Sunscorched Desert and Survivor's Encampment, making 4 Sand Warrior tokens and pinging Mika with the Sunscorched Desert for 1. Pat then plays Broken Bond on the Inspiring Statuary, blowing it up and putting out a Maze of Ith. Going to combat, Pat is able to easily swing Hazezon at Max since Desert Walk is now active because Max controls the Scavenger Grounds, and Slicer goes at Mika. Mika dies from the first strike damage, putting only 2 counters onto the Jitte, and Maximus takes 3 from Hazezon. After that, Pat draws from being the Monarch and passes. Maximus draws and plays Girapur Aether Grid, and then goes to combat. He swings Slicer at Pat, and Pat activates Maze of Ith to prevent the damage, and with nothing else, Maximus passes. Pat gets Slicer on his upkeep and draws, and then plays just a regular old desert from his graveyard, making 2 warrior tokens and pinging Max for 2 thanks to Impact Tremors. He then plays Hour of Promise, getting to find 2 more deserts, making 4 more Sand Warriors and 2 zombie tokens for a total of 6 damage to Max. Pat then cycles Tranquil Thicket to draw a card and moves to combat. He swings a team of Maximus, who takes the first strike damage from Slicer to get some counters from the Jitte, and then uses the Jitte counters to kill Hazezon. Once Hazezon is dead, he then shoots down some Sand Warriors with the Aether Grid and gains 2 from Jitte, but unfortunately, after some quick math, learns he's still dead, and we move to the next game. Game review time. So this video was 59 minutes and 38 seconds, although a lot of it was spent milling. Mika's use of Maddening Cacophony was actually really fun, and unfortunately he had no real payoffs once everything was milled. I usually see that card followed by something like Rise of the Dark Realms where you get to steal the best creatures, but I think it was a little bit too soon for that. I think all it did was put a giant target on his back for making us mill half of our library, and I'll be completely honest, I started seeing a little bit red towards him when he took my Zupandrel. I thought Halana and Alena did relatively well. I had that Unnatural Growth, which is just a really fun card since you can layer the triggers so that you get the maximum double and then the counters, which is really just good. And the Pure Strain Genestealer was actually a great card to have early on, as it allowed me to continue to ramp even when missing land drops. I was actually surprised that Maximus didn't slam out Slicer as soon as he was able to. Typically when I see the deck, that's exactly what people do, and they start ping-ponging him around the table for maximum commander damage. I did like his usage of equipment with that Tenga, as it definitely escalated how much commander damage was happening per combat step. And the Gear per Aether Grid was particularly fun since it allowed him to tap his equipment to deal with troublesome blockers so that his Slicer could smash in. I hope everyone enjoyed Pat's debut, and the debut of the new Hazezon, which I kind of actually didn't know existed. It's a cool design, and for only 3 mana you get a decent 3/3, and it was actually pretty fun to see that Desert Walk was actually relevant this game. And it does force you to pick a lot of interesting lands, sometimes that aren't particularly good, but I think he made the most of it. Actually, milling his library did kind of help him, since it allowed him to hit his lands basically every turn, so that was kind of cool. This video wouldn't be possible without the help from my sponsors, Cool Stuff Inc., Multizone, Original Magic Art, and Alter Sleeves. But it definitely wouldn't be possible without the help from you, the viewers, and my patrons. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and to remember, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.